The land that was in my mother-in-law's name, I've gone ahead and changed it to my name. The eldest son's wife, who had unilaterally changed the deed of the land I inherited from my late husband into her name. It's true that we never got along, but I never expected her to go this far. When I looked to my eldest son for help, there he was, looking at me with a cold gaze. Always picking on my wife, you're the worst, Mom. If you have even a shred of remorse, just graciously hand over the land to my wife and show some sincerity by living out the rest of your life as a maid. My eldest son was taking his wife's side. Let me be clear, I never intended to pick on her. If anything, I was the one being bullied. But in this situation, I didn't think anything I said would get through. I became so fed up with trying to persuade them, I decided to leave, just as the eldest son's wife suggested. So I should be the one to leave, right? I asked to be sure, only to be mocked for not crying and for putting on a brave face. But I wonder who's really putting on a brave face. After I leave, what will become of these two? They probably haven't realized yet. My husband and I were both in our late 50s. We have 2 sons who are both married with their own families, living away from home. So now, it's just the 2 of us, a quiet couple's life. Where we live is the epitome of the countryside that anyone would imagine. Without a car, it's inconvenient to get to the nearest train station, and there's a bus, but it only runs about twice an hour during commute times and doesn't operate on Sundays or holidays. There's a liquor store that doubles as a convenience store, in name only, standing alone at the center of the village. My eldest son despised this rural lifestyle. He wanted to go to a more prosperous high school in the nearby area, but ended up reluctantly attending a local agricultural school because his grades weren't good enough. With that resentment, upon graduating high school, he left home as if fleeing. My eldest son married a woman he met while living in the city he always dreamed of, and he has continued to live there, rarely visiting his childhood home. The eldest son and his wife have returned home a few times for marriage greetings, but other than that, they don't come by at all, nor do they get in touch. Still, they are family, and sometimes there are urgent matters that can't be ignored. In our family, it has been the daughters-in-law who have traditionally handled matters concerning the house. Even without close friendships, it's been that way. So, when I've needed to see my eldest son's wife, I've been the one to make the trip. Because my daughter-in-law really dislikes the countryside. When I visit, she says I bring a country smell and sprays air freshener around me. At first, it bothered me, but now I've learned to let it slide as a trivial matter. Especially because our relationship is already distant, and I didn't want to make it more awkward. Meanwhile, my second son lives in a remote area due to his job. The town where the second son and his wife live isn't much different from the rural town where he grew up. The second son says driving isn't too much of a hassle for him, and he often comes home to check on us, his parents. His wife is a charming woman with a generous nature, and we share similar values, which is why our relationship with her is exceptionally good. Then, while still in my late 50s, my husband passed away unexpectedly. I was engulfed in sorrow. My husband often said that when he passed away first, his only wish was that I wouldn't struggle and would complete the rest of my life without hardship. He said that if the land and house that have been passed down through his ancestors became too much for me to handle or a hindrance in my life, I should prioritize my life over them. In other words, once I inherited them, I could do as I pleased. My husband did talk to our eldest son about inheriting the land and house, a family tradition. But my city-loving eldest son, and especially his wife, vehemently refused, saying, unless it's prime real estate in a major city like New York, inheriting worthless rural land is pointless. So, the eldest son followed her wish and desired something else. The second son also preferred something other than the land and house, so he inherited other assets. I learned later that the second son thought it best for me to inherit the place filled with our memories. The second son and his wife considered moving back and living with me, but they decided against it because it would be too much of a burden on his commute. Still, they've told me warmly not to overdo it on my own, and that if it ever became unavoidable, they would be open to living together at home. I have no intention of sacrificing my sons' lives to be tied down to the land and house. When the time comes, I'll make a clean decision. Thus, I took the land and house, and the sons split the remaining assets evenly. After a while, development began nearby, and the value of the land started to rise. I'm in my 60s now, but I still have plenty of energy and enthusiasm for country life. As the development proceeds, the opinions and feelings about it vary among the people. For me, if a supermarket is built close by, I won't need to drive, and it could help avoid family disputes over issues like giving up driving licenses in old age. Most importantly, if it reduces the worries of my caring second son and his wife, then the development isn't all bad. I'm honestly excited about possibly having a more convenient life. However, I never imagined that my peace would be disrupted by the unexpected actions of my eldest son's wife. As the development progressed and rumors spread about an increase in bus services to the nearest station and the construction of high-rise apartments nearby, my estranged eldest son reached out. He said something along the lines of, "My attempt to make it big in the city has failed, and I've ended up quitting my job. Trying to earn a living in the city was a fleeting dream." I urged him to get to the point. Then he expressed a desire to return and live at home. When I asked him, "So, you want to live together?" he seemed to affirm, but with hesitant phrasing. About a month ago, at my husband's third-year memorial, a family gathering took place. At that time, my eldest son still complained about the countryside odor, so what had changed his mind? In the middle of our conversation, his wife abruptly interjected. "You really live in a lovely place. If it's getting all modern with the land development, you should have said so. Some places have gotten a better view since the mountain trees were cut down. There have been rumors for quite a while that a large shopping mall might go in there." The eldest son's wife didn't care about the countryside property before, thinking it wasn't worth considering, but now that it's developing into a more livable area, she's singing a different tune. The land and house my husband left us are in a very good location. Besides the spot where our house stands, the mountain behind our home is also land I inherited from my husband. There's gonna be land purchases with the development, right? Are you gonna let go of the mountain behind the house? I see. The eldest son and his wife regret not caring for this countryside property before. They can't say they want to inherit the land now, so they're cozying up to me, probably wanting a cut of the money if I sell the mountain. Oh dear, how awful of me. The real issue isn't money, it's about my husband. I listened skeptically to the eldest son's wife's excuses, which seemed quite theatrical. It felt like I was being subjected to a poor speech. To put it simply, it seems true that the eldest son has lost his job and is now unemployed. Their savings are so low they're worried about next month's rent. When I asked about the inheritance split with the younger son, she'd rather not touch that if possible. It's only been since the 3rd anniversary of my husband's death, so she says she wants to be thoughtful about how to use the money he left, but if they're struggling that much, they should use it. I thought. I held back from saying that, as it would likely result in accusations of being cold-hearted. Struggling to pay for rent, gas, and electricity, the eldest son's wife makes a heartfelt appeal, her voice choked with tears. She's asking to move in with me. Live in the countryside? You, who hated the countryside and were adamant about living in the city. I suggested that the eldest son take over, asking if he's going to find a job in the countryside. Wouldn't you be better off re-employing in the city? I asked. It was hard to imagine the eldest son, who left for the city as if he was running away from home, accepting a rural life now. The eldest son says he's in a tight spot, soon even eating will become difficult, so he's asking for help. Until the very end, he doesn't clearly say whether he's looking to re-employ in the city or the countryside. So, I set conditions. Moving in is temporary, just until the eldest son finds a new job. I added that he needs to work, even if it's just part-time, while living with us. In this area, with the land development, there's an increase in short-term job postings. I figured he'd get hired if he wasn't too picky. I thought, if I take care of them for about 6 months, they'd save up a decent amount of money and be ready for a fresh start. Marriage is about helping each other out, after all. I assumed the eldest son's wife would also work outside, even if not every day, to help gather funds for their new start. But when we actually started living together, all my plans fell apart. The eldest son was indeed busy looking for work. He searched for jobs during the day and worked as a security guard at construction sites for a few hours in the evening. The eldest son's wife, who had been meek at first, changed her tune as soon as her husband started spending long hours away from home for job hunting and part-time work. Oh, this is such a drag. I can't stand it. Using a pickup for shopping is just too tacky for me. Shopping had become a once-a-week affair, and the convenience of a pickup truck was simply unmatched, unlike the fancy cars you'd see in the city. She was the one who had offered to do the shopping. But after going once, she complained that the pickup was too embarrassing and refused to go again. In front of her husband, she'd praise my cooking and express a desire to learn, but when he wasn't around, she'd do the exact opposite. She couldn't stand the country-style cooking, craving French cuisine instead. She'd complain about mom's home cooking being annoying and then skip her turn to cook. One day, my eldest son's wife said she was gonna cook dinner tonight, so trusting her word, I headed off to tend to the backwoods. Without regular checkups and asking folks to cut down trees, the woods can get wild in no time. It's especially important around the change of seasons and dealing with fallen leaves, and since my husband passed, I've been hiring some young folks from the community to help out. But I can't always leave it to others, so I sometimes go to check on things myself. After making my rounds in the mountains, I came home exhausted in the evening only to find no lights on in the house and the doors locked, leaving me unable to get in. I tried calling my eldest son's wife's cell, but couldn't get through, and was at my wit's end when my son came home. As I was explaining the situation, the eldest son's wife arrived, so I confronted her, asking where she'd been and why she'd locked up. "How could you?" she snapped. "I did just like you told me, went shopping, and you forget what you asked for." She went on to tell my son that I insisted on having some fancy dish for dinner and said if she couldn't serve that dish tonight, she should leave the house. I never said any such thing and didn't even know I'd been left alone. But my son just took his wife's side without question. "Just because we're living together reluctantly doesn't mean you should pick on my wife. She's not used to country living. You can't expect her to find ingredients for some fancy dishes out here in the boonies." He accused me of deliberately making her go out as a form of harassment, even though he knew better. My son and I have always had our differences and have had our fair share of arguments in the past, but this was the first time I was berated so unfairly and one-sidedly. I was looking at my son, and yet he felt like a stranger, which was heartbreaking. I don't demand he take my side. But in the world, husbands tend to have a happier marriage when they side with their wives, and my late husband always stood by me. However, he always made sure to listen to both sides, so we had a good relationship with his mother while she was alive. But my son just yells at me, taking his wife's word over mine. Suddenly he turned surly and said, "Well, that fancy dish you're so keen on? Go ahead and make it yourself and eat all you want. I'm taking my wife out to eat." He snatched the keys from his wife and threw them at me before heading back the way he came. When I entered the house, I saw that my son's wife hadn't done a stitch of housework. It was just as I left it in the morning. I was so upset, I couldn't stop crying. But there was so much to do, it almost seemed a waste to wipe away the tears, so I just got on with the chores while crying. Later, the owner of the only diner around here, where we used to go as a family when the kids were little, came by to see if I was all right. My husband and the diner owner were childhood friends. And I knew my son was aware of his dad's fondness for the place. It turns out my son and his wife had been bad-mouthing me there. The owner said my son's wife was the one filling his head with all this stuff about me. I didn't go into details, just thanked the owner for letting me know. He said to call if I ever needed anything and didn't pry further. Though he looked sad, saying, "Guess people change when they move to the city, huh?" After all this, I decided not to expect anything from my son's wife anymore. If my efforts to get along don't get through, then it's just a waste of time. Better to spend that time and energy getting the chores done myself. I'd be no different from my son's wife if I thought about getting back at her for what she did. As usual, no matter what my son's wife did, I prepared meals for 3 and did the laundry for 3. Whether she thought it was her due or was pleased to have manipulated things in her favor, she continued to act like a guest in the house. Then one day, she came out with something that floored me. "This property and house that's in your name, I'm in the process of transferring it to my name." She claimed that she already had all the paperwork ready, flashing the documents at me. But since she didn't show them clearly, it only increased my suspicion about her story. Given my familiarity with such papers from when my husband transferred the property to me, they looked like obvious fakes. When I asked her if they were real, she retorted, "Of course, they are. From now on, I'm taking over as the head of this household. If you don't want to be kicked out, then show some remorse and apologize for the way you've treated your daughter-in-law as punishment. How about this? Continue to live here as my personal maid. If that doesn't suit you, you're welcome to leave." Her bold attitude suggested she believed the documents she held were legitimate. I confronted my eldest son, demanding an explanation. "Shouldn't you be the one leaving if you can't keep your promise to live together?" I tried to argue with common sense, but my eldest son retorted that I was the one who broke our promise first. "It's a shame to be raised by the worst kind of mother who bullies her daughter-in-law. If you feel bad about it, then as a mother, you should just retire and leave everything to your son. Just because we've clashed, doesn't mean you should take it out on my wife out of spite. That's the lowest thing a person can do. Aren't you ashamed, a grown woman acting like this?" My daughter-in-law managed to convince my son that I was harsh on her because I hated him. Using what she had heard about our differences in values and our incompatible temperaments, my daughter-in-law took advantage of the situation. Given that my relationship with my eldest son was already strained, it was easy for her to make things worse. Realizing that nothing I said to my son now would be believed, I felt that trying to persuade him was a waste of energy. Suddenly, my husband's words crossed my mind. "Fine. I'll consider everything you've said. But I need a week's grace period because I have preparations of my own," I consented. My daughter-in-law was reluctant, but my eldest son agreed. It took exactly 1 week to sort out what belongings to take and to find a new place to move to, among other necessary arrangements. After the agreed week, I left the house. As I was leaving, my daughter-in-law taunted me with a triumphant look, telling me to get out. I didn't respond to her insults and left the house in silence, giving myself a mental fist pump. This was the beginning of my comeback. 1 month later, just as I expected, I received a frantic call from my daughter-in-law. She was in a frenzy because when she tried to cash in by selling the land immediately, she was told it was already in the process of being subdivided and couldn't be sold. "What have you done?" she screamed in a shrill voice that was unbearable, spewing insults like a machine gun. In the midst of local land development, there had been an offer to buy the forested hill behind our house along with the land as a package. The condition was that it had to be sold as a set. It was a welcome offer as managing the hill on my own was challenging. Yet, I still had a desire to live in the house I had shared with my husband a bit longer, so I put the offer on hold. During this time, the issue of our home's deterioration came up. A relative in construction had mentioned concerns about our ancestral home's aging condition when they visited for my husband's memorial service. The house felt too large for just me alone, a sharp contrast to when it felt just right for 3 generations. I couldn't deny a sense of loneliness being left behind in it. Even if I rebuilt the house, my sons probably wouldn't live there anyway. I began to think it might be best to sell it after my husband's 7th death anniversary. The company interested in buying the forest and land told me such developments take years, so there was no rush. However, the start of cohabitation with my eldest son and his wife gradually shifted my plans. Determined not to wait until my husband's 7th memorial, I decided to let go of the house. The company even offered to cover the cost of demolishing the house and clearing the land, which was a relief to me. I couldn't bear the thought of my eldest son's wife, who believed she had a genuine contract, doing as she pleased with the land my husband had left. I refused to give in to her, nor to my eldest son, who followed his wife's words without any doubt. I informed my younger son of everything that had happened and shared my decision. He said he was sad to see the family home go, but reminded me that memories are held in the heart, not in things. Moreover, my younger son and his wife had offered me to live with them. I know there's some anxiety about leaving the familiar place, but this area is pretty rural, too, so I think they'll come to like it. I'm currently living with my second son and his wife, and I'm really happy with their kindness. I just let the first son's wife screaming go in one ear and out the other, and end the call myself at just the right moment, switching to block the incoming calls. Later, my eldest son, having asked around the relatives about where I was, came to the second son's house. He came crying to me for help. Thinking it was too late, I was about to send him back, but then he started telling me how it was all his wife's doing after she kicked me out. It all started when a friend of the first son's wife introduced her to a paralegal. She trusted her friend, so of course, she also believed the paralegal without doubt. She was told she could change the land and house from my name to hers by just giving a thank you fee. Moreover, she was told the fee could be less than half the market rate. Later, when a big sum of money would come in, she thought they could just cover any shortfall from my husband's estate. On the promised day, the friend and the paralegal prepared the transfer documents and handed them over to the first son's wife. She, without any suspicion, believed them to be genuine and handed over the thank you fee. Once the preparations were done, the first son's wife eagerly explained everything to the eldest son when he came back from his part-time job. Exhausted, the eldest son didn't think deeply and trusted his wife's words as the truth. If you think about it, it's a strange story that the wife becomes the homeowner while her husband is still alive, but she convinced him by saying, "It'll be more convenient for your mom if it's in my name." As a fellow housewife, we can have a heart-to-heart and work things out. He foolishly agreed after being told such a plausible story. While the eldest son was out looking for a job and doing part-time work, the first son's wife methodically planned to kick me out, and by brainwashing the eldest son behind my back, she successfully managed to get me out. However, when she triumphantly went to sell the house and land, she was told it was impossible because the land was still being divided and got desperate. She tried to contact the friend and the paralegal, but couldn't reach them. Eventually, their phone got disconnected, and when she contacted the friend's parents' house, she was told they had disowned the criminal and didn't know where she was. That's when she finally learned that her friend had been a repeat fraudster and was a convicted criminal. The first son's wife later found out that many of her former classmates had been victims of this friend. The friend had been introducing former classmates as fake lawyers, accountants, and paralegals, and swindling them out of their service fees. The first son's wife had mentioned the land to her friend, which led to the introduction of the so-called paralegal. Among the victims, some had filed police reports, while others had given up, considering it a costly lesson. Those people could say that because they still had a home, even though they lost money. The eldest son and his wife, having lost money, their home, and the inheritance, had to focus on sorting out the situation before even considering filing a complaint. When I suggested that they should be able to rent an apartment since most of the inheritance should still be there, the eldest son said that the ATM card for the account where the inheritance was deposited had been swapped out with a different card. By the time they realized, all the money had been withdrawn. He came begging, genuinely broke, pleading for help. He explained that the first son's wife had been told that additional charges had arisen because the document preparation had been quite a hassle, and she went to withdraw money with her friend. That's probably when the PIN was stolen. I've heard that if you hire a pro to swap cards, you won't even notice it. Driven by immediate greed and lacking attention, the first son's wife had become an easy target after blabbering about the inheritance to her friend. I heard that a little while back, warnings had been circulating from the alma mater of my eldest son's wife. They'd been alerting that a graduate had been repeatedly defrauding classmates and juniors, so be careful with contacts and offers from people you don't usually keep in touch with. But the first son's wife, thinking only idiots fall for scams, ignored the alerts. I turned away from my eldest son and his wife, believing they got what they deserved for being driven by greed. Though the inheritance was gone, I was sure the eldest had some money saved from his part-time job. But that measly part-time pay? Gone with the wind on drink tabs, for sure. Led astray by drinking buddies, his savings from part-time work dwindled to nothing. It's your own fault for not planning ahead. I rebuffed him once more. Just as I was getting troubled by his persistence, my daughter-in-law from my second son came home. Her return, GI slung over her shoulder, radiated such a force that my eldest felt a threat and skedaddled. The second son's wife had recently taken up self-defense as a hobby. When the homeward-bound daughter-in-law from martial arts classes ran into the lingering eldest, he got scared and beat it. Saved by the bell. I thanked my daughter-in-law from my second son for the timely rescue. The eldest son and his wife, having been living as live-in workers at a diner run by a childhood friend of my husband, got booted for continuously griping about the low pay compared to the big city. Do they even know what gratitude is? After that, no one would lend a hand to my eldest son and his wife. They somehow survived until one day, a new house was built on the land where we used to live. Seeing this, my eldest son's wife snapped and broke in. "This is my land and house. It was supposed to be mine." Spouting such nonsense and squatting there led to the police being called and her arrest on the spot. I was contacted by the police as a potential guarantor, but I refused. Then she started her silence, saying she wouldn't talk unless her mother came. The police asked me to help persuade her, but I refused as well. "Your son is asking for help," they relayed, but I felt no obligation to assist, suggesting they might as well lock him up. When the eldest son's wife was arrested, she claimed she had been tricked by a fraud. Apparently, there were a number of similar complaints filed, which made her story seem credible, but that doesn't mean her crimes were erased. She got squeezed for all she was worth, and I heard that the friend and the fake paralegal who committed the fraud are still at large. Even if they are caught, my son was told that the stolen money won't be returned. It seems that he has finally seen the light after the inheritance was not only used without permission but also stolen. The couple divorced, each starting a new path, but my eldest son seems to struggle finding stable work. His ex-wife, having had enough of the countryside, vanished one day after working at a seedy bar back in the city, leaving behind significant debts. I've officially moved in with my second son and his wife. The living arrangement started as a trial due to the ordeal with the eldest son's family. I didn't want to burden my daughter-in-law. But living together turned out great. We say what we want without tension and click well since she's not overbearing. Most importantly, we share the same taste and exchange recipes, making every day enjoyable. The considerate environment we've built doesn't strain us with needless courtesies. Neighbors even mistake my daughter-in-law and me for mother and daughter. That's how well we get along. As my husband would have wished, I'm savoring life with my second son and his family. Looking forward to sharing these stories. I prayed at my husband's grave.